for those who might not be familiar with CTLCV, we're dedicated to informing and empowering voters, lawmakers, and advocates on key environmental and democracy issues. That's through our C4, and then we're also lucky enough to have a C3 that allows us to do webinars like this on all sorts of topics. Today, I'm honored to have two incredibly and passionate speakers about environmental justice. We have Jameson Davis, the founder of Righting Wrongs, LLC, and the president of the African American Society. And he will share insights on the intersection of racial justice and a federal look at environmental justice. And then we also have Marc Gonzalez, the program coordinator for the Conservation Law Foundation, and he'll discuss it much more in the sense of Connecticut. And again, some quick reminders. Please stay muted until the end of the presentations, but feel free to drop any questions in the chat. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A, and then you guys can raise your hand or ask a question in chat, and I'll call on it directly and ask both the panelists today on the question. And so we'll start off with Jameson, but let me share my screen first.
Well, while you do that, let me just take a moment to thank you, Liliana, for one, creating this platform for both me and Marc to speak on. It is a true honor to be here and to have such an important conversation. I truly appreciate the opportunity to engage in this topic.
Thank you. That's very nice. Let me get to it. People never give me compliments on webinars.
Well, as somebody who's putting together myself many and many times, I know what goes behind the scenes. So again,
And
appreciate
everyone can
your
see my screen?
yes.
Perfect. Right. So yeah, it has an overarching theme of the quality of life and then environmental justice.
All right, you ready to go? All right, let's do it. So to truly understand environmental justice, we first must acknowledge environmental racism. So environmental racism, as we know, is the deliberate systemic targeting of Black and other communities of color and neighborhoods of color for environmental harm, right? While wider and wealthier areas remain shielded. So this is one of the reasons why some EJ leaders and some EJ historians trace the origins of environmental justice as far back as 1619, right? When the first slave ships arrived here with enslaved Africans. Recognizing that that is the beginning of a long history of systemic burdens placed on Black communities for the benefit of others. So environmental racism also encapsulates this history of excluding Black and other people of color from leadership roles within the environmental movement itself. When it comes to environmental justice and the definition of environmental justice, we'll use the EPA's definition for that. Although it may not still be visible on the EPA's website, unfortunately, based on, I believe, the March 6th update, or even possibly even earlier than that. The agency defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Right. A stark contrast to the previous administration, this current administration, their strategy is to dismantle environmental justice, right? And the efforts, and that's kind of really evident in the numerous of vacancies on the website itself. As I mentioned, if you go to the website, you'll see a ton of vacancies under the EJ tab. And that really, signals a deliberate rollback of the progress in a disregard for communities most impacted by environmental harms. We can go to slide 3. Thank you. So, what does all that really mean, though, right? How do we determine when an environmental harm is not just an issue of pollution, but also a matter of justice and systemic inequality? So, that's really when it involves one of or more, really, of the following, right? So, targeted environmental burdens, which is the intentional or unintentional, often systemic targeting to bear an environmental burden, whether that burden is pollution or degradation, because of the community's racial or ethnic makeup, right? Whether it's their socioeconomic status as well of the residents, their national origin. It's those individuals that take on the burden for the rest of society, while the rest of society reaps the benefits. And those benefits can be anything from economic to aesthetics, right? Then there's discriminatory policy decisions. Those are zoning laws. Those are industrial sightings, infrastructure projects, redlining, highways driven through Black communities, waste sites in vulnerable communities. These all things exacerbate health risks. Okay, and then you have government neglect, right? That's the lackluster, or to be quite honest, oftentimes the non-existent response from local, state, or federal officials to solve the issues due to the racial ethnic makeup of that community, or their socioeconomic status, right? So zero sense of urgency, like no sense of urgency whatsoever. It's when agencies or bureaucrats really fail to respond adequately to the environmental crisis in these Black or other communities of color, right? Think of Flint, think of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, right? Then there's the unequal enforcement of regulations, which really deals with environmental laws and regulations not being consistently enforced, allowing industries to go into these communities, these disadvantaged communities, and pollute with really impunity, right? If you look down the bottom right hand corner of this slide, you'll see a quick little a visual, and that talks about some of the issues that are found in communities of color. And one of them I want to point out, which is 95% of cases brought in front of the EPA by communities of color have been denied, right? So that speaks to the unequal enforcement of environmental regulations and laws. And then there's a limited power and representation piece, right? Which talks about affected communities often having, less influence in decision-making processes and procedures, feeling left out or left behind, their voices not being involved in the development of policies and procedures that have a tremendous, significant impact on their quality of life. So as I was developing, this first part of our presentation, I had to kind of not go in some rabbit holes that I want to go down. So I'm going to leave you with some tidbits. If you want to do some more research later, you're more than welcome to. But in correlation with limited political power and representation, you can also put something there for regulatory justice, right? Regulatory justice. And then sacrifice communities. I myself tend to stay away from using the term marginalized. Um, I like to, be very poignant with my wordage, and so sacrifice communities, right? And so, what is a sacrifice community or a sacrifice zone? That's a populated area with high levels of pollution and environmental hazards. And that's due to the makeups of the community that we mentioned earlier, such as the demographics, the economic status, and other social determinants of health, such as education, access to food and water, and things of that nature. And these areas are called these sacrifice zones in communities because the health and safety of these people in these communities is oftenly effectively sacrificed, right, for the economic benefit and gains and prosperity of others outside that community. So those who live in these sacrifice zones or communities are often more likely to develop conditions such as asthma, respiratory disease, or cancer because of their environment. Next slide, please. So to really truly understand environmental justice and kind of the evolution of it all, and how the things that are happening at the federal government affect our quality of life, you really have to have a quick understanding of the history, right? The civil rights history of environmental justice. So let's take a very, very, very quick look of the history, highlighting some of the movement's significant milestones, right? So we'll start again in 1619 when the first Dutch ship arrived on what would become the United States of America, carrying enslaved Africans as cargo, right? More than 400 years later, this injustice not only persists, but it has evolved into really the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest health threat to Black communities, low-income communities, and other communities of color. 1968, we have the Memphis sanitation strike, right? And this was a strike where they were workers frustrated by the city's response and really a long pattern of neglect and abuse. About 1,300 Black men from the Memphis Department of Public Works, led by T.O. Jones, who was a garbage collector turned into an organizer. And after about a month of their protesting, MLK joined them in. And the reason why this is significant is because this is how the mainstream world would learn and be introduced to environmental justice. And then we moved down to 1982, Warren County, North Carolina. All right. Some of the initial environmental justice movement, some of it sparked from this incident. And so in 1982, a small, predominantly African American community was designated to host a hazardous waste landfill. And this landfill would accept PCB contaminated soil that was resulted from illegal dumping of toxic waste from the roadways. And so in response, after the removal of the soil, the state of North Carolina was looking for communities to put the soil in. And unfortunately, of course, they chose the predominantly Black community. So in response to the state's decision, the NAACP and others staged a massive protest. Over the time, more than about 500 protesters were arrested. As you can see in the picture, they literally laid their bodies and their life on the line, on the ground. And while the protest didn't lead to the site being removed, the site moved forward. What it did do is that it provided a national start for the environmental justice movement. 5 years later, the probably one of the most important reports of environmental justice is the original breakthrough report that brought environmental justice really to the forefront of the national attention as well. And this was in as you see, the late 80s, 1987. United Church of Christ, the UCC, conducted a national study on the racial or socioeconomic characteristics of communities burdened with hazardous waste sites. The report's core findings were really kind of undeniable and quite stark, right? Which is communities with a higher percentage of non-white residents were far more likely to be targeted for toxic waste facilities, right? A disproportionate number of these sites were placed in urban communities near Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, deliberately exposing these communities to environmental hazards while others reap the benefits, as we discussed earlier. So simply put, what this report did is it let folks know if you want to find the most polluted place in your community, no matter where you are in the country, you simply had to find the darkest person home. Like, let that sink in for a second, right? Regardless of where you live or where you're from, if you want to find the most polluted places in your neighborhood or in your town or in your state, you just had to file somebody either of color or Black home. And then in 1991, the first National People of Color Environmental Summit, which was probably, in my opinion, the most important single event in the movement's history. And the reason why that is because this summit really brought in the environmental justice movement, right? When we think of environmental justice right now, a lot of it is roped into intersectional environmentalism, right? And so in this summit, this is when the movement kind of went beyond the anti-toxic focus and started to bring in other issues like public health and worker safety and transportation, housing, resource collection, community empowerment, right? So what that meeting really did is it demonstrated that it's possible to build multiracial grassroots movements and environmental economic justice together. So here's where the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice was created and published. And I want to take a quick second to just read the first sentence, which is, we, the people of color, gathered at this multinational People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit to begin to build a national and international movement for all people of color to fight the destruction and taking of our lands and communities. Do hereby reestablish our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of our Mother Earth. Next slide, please. And then we jump to 1994, right? Which is a really important year for environmental justice because this is when President Clinton signed in Executive Order 12898, which is the federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. This was issued in 94 with the purpose to focus federal attention on environmental and human health effects of the federal actions, based on federal actions, right? Minority low-income populations, really with the goal of achieving environmental protection for all communities. So what the executive order did is it directed federal agencies to identify and address disproportionate high and adverse human health or environmental effects of their actions to minority or low income, right? And that was to the greatest extent permitted by the law. So what the order really did is that it directed each agency to develop a strategy to implement environmental justice. It was intended to promote a non-discrimination in the federal programs that affected human health and the environment. So as well as providing low-income and minority communities access to public information and public participation, right? Because as we said earlier, political clout is one of the things that is a factor, I should say, of a community being an environmental justice community. And then lastly, I just wanted to bring, to the attention, we talked about in the beginning of this timeline, North Carolina, Warren County, right? 1982. So 20 years later, 2002, finally, after all the protesting and fighting and all the work that was being done on the back end, I'm sure with organizing and advocating and litigation and everything else, the remediation funds were put into the budget in 1998, and the cleanup began in 2002, and the landfill was closed in 2003. So that is a bit of a story to just show that one, there are victories, and victories do happen, but there is a ton of work that needs to happen in between, right? Next slide, please. So now let's kind of talk about the evolution of environmental justice. Like we know, environmental justice was really kind of based in civil rights, started in civil rights, and kind of what does it look like today, and how has it evolved from then to now? So environmental justice has its roots in civil rights, its genesis in environmental racism, and the way I describe it is that it is the love child between civil rights and environmental protection. Okay. The number of groups fighting for environmental justice has increased, and that's generally due to the exclusion of BIPOC communities from the mainstream environmental movement. If you want more information on that, feel free to look up Dr. Dorcita Taylor's research on the percentage of people of color in these high-ranking environmental organizations. You can check out her original report as well as a follow-up report. Environmental justice has greatly expanded due to federal actions. We talked about EL 12898, and we also talked about the EJ principles. And the expansion has also grown to include rural as well as urban and suburban, acknowledging that many white communities can also be environmental justice communities due to disenfranchisement and political neglect. But one of the key and probably the most recent, definitely the most recent evolution that we'll explore a little bit later is the urgent need to shift the focus of environmental justice to states' rights, right? And that's because as these federal protections erode, it's really up to the states to step in, craft policies, procedures, and safeguards, procedures that safeguard the residents of Connecticut, and that really reflects the values of the state and the commitment to being truly safe for all folks within the state. Next slide, please. So now we'll go over federal protections, right? What did it look like previously? What does it look like now in the first less than 3 months of the new presidency, right? During the Biden presidency, efforts to address environmental justice and communities of color underwent a pretty significant expansion. Neighborhoods were being offering neighborhoods, and advocates a chance to have additional federal fundings to combat a lot of the injustices that they face and the pollution that they face within their communities. Biden administration in 2021 to 2024 really strengthened protections, right? They restored NEPA, including EJ. They expanded the offices of environmental justice in the EPA, but actually throughout the federal government, right? Justice 40 was a huge success, right? Directing 40% of federal investments. I actually went to a conference and learned that was actually closer to 60% rather than the 40%. The Biden administration had stricter air and water pollution standards, PFAS regulations, which was a huge deal, as well as the emissions, not to mention, Dr. Michael Reagan was appointed the head of the EPA, which was a first. And then we get into where we are currently, right, which is underneath the Trump administration, which is gutting NEPA, weakening community input, defunding and marginalizing the EPA and EJ programs, completely removing them and the folks who are leading them, roll back on Clean Air Act regulations, weakening Clean Air Act as a whole, rescinding federal climate commitments and reversing renewable energy initiatives, and this polluter first policy mentality, right? Benefiting corporations at the expense of public health. The Trump administration is hyper focused on capitalism, right? Capitalism over public health and safety. I mean, the first 60 days of his second term really showed that. I mean, he dismantled anti-pollution programs, shut down regulatory offices, and really begin a sweeping rollback of environmental protections. So he didn't do it by himself. You know, he needed help. So the EPA head, Lee Zeldin, has been in the press and he's been very clear with his words. And the words are the EPA's role is to assist the great American comeback, right? The great American comeback. That's the role of the EPA in the eyes of uh, Lee Zeldin. The Trump administration has said that it wants to shift the EPA mission from protecting air, water, and land to move to seek to have impact to lower the cost of buying a car, heating a home, and running a business. Again, that capitalism over public health and safety, right? Mr. Zeldin has also said that he intends to um, cut the agency's spending by 65% and eliminate the scientific research arm. So remember that kind of rabbit hole list that I gave you guys earlier? So add one more to that and put Chevron deference. Okay. That's going to be probably a deeper rabbit hole than the first one. But you have my email at the end of it. Feel free to reach out. We can talk it through. The Trump administration has also said that they want to repeal dozens of the nation's most significant environmental regulations, including limits on pollution from tailpipes, smokestacks, and then protections from wetlands. They've also wanted to pull back on focus on the coal ash disposal as well as emissions from methane um, and potent greenhouse gases that come from oil and gas facilities, which is all what they kind of put into a memo recently. Also in the memos, in recent memos, the EPA has said that enforcement actions will no longer shut down any stage of energy production. So let that sink in for a quick second. The EPA will no longer shut down any stage of energy production, regardless of what they find in terms of pollution and burden placed on communities. They went even further and they said no consideration may be given to whether those affected by potential violations constitute minority or low-income population. So, I mean, in simple layman terms, what they're saying is that this means that when they're deciding whether the rule, whether a rule or a law has been broken, that officials aren't allowed to take into account, whether the affected folks are from minority or low-income communities. I mean, basically, what they're saying is they're giving kind of the companies who are in these gas and oil sectors a break in the law, saying that the EPA does not intend to hold them accountable, right? So some of the more significant policy changes that you'll see is the rollbacks of regulations of carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. So currently, right now, the EPA requires existing coal burning power plants and new gas power plants built in the United States to cut their greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2039. That's getting rolled back, right? Rewriting tailpipe pollution standards that were designed to ensure that the majority of new cars and light trucks sold in the United States were all going to be electric by 2032. That's also being rolled back. They had discussions about easing limits on mercury emissions from power plants, as well as restrictions on soot and haze from coal burning, right? Under the Biden administration, it was aimed to slash about 70% of emissions from coal burning power plants of mercury, which has been linked to developmental, damage in children. That's also being rolled back, right? One of the more significant for the nation as a whole is the effort to reverse the 2009 legal opinion known as the EPA endangerment finding, right? This finding gives the agency the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Eliminating it would be virtually impossible for the EPA to curb climate pollution from automobiles, factories, power plants, as well as gas. But probably the one that will affect Connecticut residents' quality of life the most is the Good Neighbor Plan, right? The Good Neighbor Plan, which expanded federal pollution controls across state lines, is being scrapped, right? So this means that states have more control over air quality standards, and many critics think that this could lead to dirtier air for everybody. Next slide, please. So how federal deregulations affect the quality of life for Connecticut residents, right? So air quality deterioration, talked about that. Increased emissions from power plants, right? Higher asthma and respiratory illness rates, water contamination risk, climate vulnerability, sea level rise, lack of commitment to climate resilience. We've seen flooding and things of that nature happen on the East Coast as high as Vermont, which it was thought was supposed to be like a safe haven for environmental issues, right? Come to find out it's not. And who suffers the most, right? We know it's usually going to be those most vulnerable, low income folks, Black communities, and other communities of color, indigenous communities as well, right? So as we kind of move forward, it's important to recognize that the erosion of federal protections is not just a political issue. It is truly not. This is a matter of life and death, literally life and death for the residents of Connecticut. These rollbacks directly threaten health, safety, and the future of our communities, and we just cannot ignore it. Right? Cannot ignore the potential devastating consequences that they bring. So I want to kind of leave you with a quote a little bit from Deborah Ramirez of Lakes Charles, Louisiana. So she says, as far as people of color, Black people, we have been through it all our lives. It's nothing new to us. Now, for everybody else, they will feel it too. And that's part of the evolution that we discussed as well as environmental justice, right? Which started off as this really civil rights centered, Black centered issue. But because it wasn't taken as seriously as it should have at the federal level, it has evolved to find itself in other communities, low income communities, disenfranchised communities, underinvested communities. So what are our leaders saying about these like deregulations? So what are they saying that's going to have an impact on our quality of life? So let me give you a little bit of what Governor Ned Lamont, Senator Blumenthal, as well as Deep Commissioner Katie Dykes has said about these rule changes. The first is there's concern that the 23 days of unhealthy ozone layers in 2024 are only going to increase. That's only going to go up, right? Asthma in the state's largest cities, already among some of the worst highest, will also go up, right? The proposed rollbacks are particularly concerning for Connecticut because we're a downwind state. And so because we rely on the federal protections to prevent other states that are upwind from us to ensure that those states are taking the proper responsibility for the air pollution, there's going to be potentially a disproportionate impact on Connecticut residents due in their air quality, right? Due to us being a downwind state. Because really, with us being a downwind state, the federal protections and the federal policies are really the only way for us to have some type of protection. The EPA itself says that as much as 96% of our air pollution impacting Connecticut comes from outside of our borders, right? As well as while Lee Zeldin and President Trump, they framed kind of this plan as like a taxpayer savings almost. But the reality is that this is going to have a tremendous impact on healthcare and healthcare costs, right? Right now, currently, Hartford is ranked among the 36 worst cities in the nation for asthma. Bridgeport, 56. New Haven's 83. 2,000 homes were destroyed or damaged in late August due to the flooding. So while drought and wildfires and flooding and other examples of climate change continue to happen and be exacerbated, this administration is simply going to ignore them. And then people in Connecticut will really only get sicker, right? Kids with asthma will have a harder time breathing, and parents will have to miss more days of work to take care of those children. I just want to do a quick time check. Okay, I'm almost done. Sorry, Mark. Next slide, please. And here I just wanted to really show the federal laws and policies that are in place and the mirror image that we have in the state, right? Because Connecticut, like many states, have adopted environmental laws that mirror federal protections, understanding the critical need to safeguard the health and well-being of the citizens, right? When the federal government sets something, that is the floor. You can't go anything below that, but you can always go above and make it stricter, right? If the federal government is going to like weaken their protections and remove preemption, then it is the state's responsibility to step up. Like we have to rise to this occasion, right? And like that's just not like not just by creating these standards, by enacting even stronger standards, right, and more effective measures to protect our community. So this is a truly urgent call to action. You know, we've seen time and time again that states have had the power to lead, and Connecticut is no exception, right? Um, so let's explore really quickly some of these mirroring rules. So like at the federal level, you have NEPA. Connecticut, what we have here is SEPA, okay, which I believe is actually right now going through some um, some pretty potentially tough changes. So advocate on behalf of your community and make sure you get involved in the conversation with SEPA. Okay. Clean Air Act. We have the Connecticut Clean Air Act. Clean Water Act. We have Connecticut Water Pollution Control Act. And then RCWA, which deals with regulating hazardous waste. Um, it's storage. Connecticut has the Connecticut Hazardous Waste Management Act, and then CERCLA, which deals with the transportation of that hazardous storage from one place to the other. The Connecticut has the Connecticut Transfer Act. Next slide, please. And so I just want to say, you know, this is really a chance for us to have an opportunity, right? We've seen what the civil rights movement has done, okay? Um, changing, you know, federal laws often starts with very, very powerful action at the local and state level in those communities pushing for change. Whether it's grassroots, frontline, individuals, communities, neighborhoods, we all need to lead in this movement, right? Now is an extremely critical time where we must apply the same strategies that were used in the civil rights movement to also be used now when we're doing the same thing at the state level, right? So really quickly, I just want to acknowledge what some of those strategies were. Building strong grassroots movements to mobilize local communities, leveraging local advocacy and litigation to challenge harmful policies, engaging in lobbying and policy advocacy to influence state lawmakers, create coalitions with allies in different sectors to amplify the push for change, and in utilizing public education campaigns to raise awareness and build momentum for the reform. So before I pass it to Marc, my final thought is this: communities have fought too hard and endured too much to be sacrificed for profit and politics. Environmental justice is a Black liberation, one shared with allies across racial, social, and economic differences. It is all of our rights to breathe clean air, drink safe water, and live in neighborhoods free from harm. We will not be silenced. We will not be ignored. The fight is now. We are we're unapologetically in it for our people, our future, and our power. So with that, I thank you for giving me this time to speak with you. I'm going to pass it over to Marc Gonzalez, who will continue the conversation based around the states. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jameson. That was so informative and just a great conversation. Thanks so much for like getting us started. Really excited to like continue the conversation with you. So yeah, so I'm speaking more on the like local state level. So I want to open with the definition of environmental justice that the state of Connecticut uses. So the state of Connecticut defines EJ around a distressed municipality as it's by the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, or a defined census block groups where 30% of the population is living below 200% of the federal poverty line. What does that mean? For a family of four in Connecticut, that'd be anyone making less than $62,400 a year. And distressed municipalities are defined around a lot of different factors, mostly around their tax base, personal income of residents, and the residents' need public services. I want to contrast that with the definition we have right now. So New York State recently passed like their Climate Act, so updated like EJ considerations, and they charged a climate justice working group with developing criteria to identify disadvantaged communities. I think there's right now, I have a draft memo with 45 indicators. They're unlikely to all stay, but I think they're like raising the conversation and raising the stakes. They're talking about environmental exposures, burdens, and climate change risk, demographic factors like age, race, and income, pollution characteristics, and health vulnerabilities. So all of this is just to say, like, there's lots of different definitions. I think like we have these definitions in the state, but it's important to like think bigger. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit also of the history. I think Jameson gave like a great intro history. I want to go like just a few quick notes. I think the beginning of my emotional timeline really begins also with European colonization. So one of the very first reservations established in North America was actually in what will become New Haven, East Haven, Brantford. So the first settlers in this area um, stole the land, kind of forced these communities into unfair treaties, and just systematically worked to thwart indigenous survival. That included limiting land access and really like using like environmental harm, impacting their ability to hunt and impacting their ability to farm. Um, and the conversation really also like just begins in this moment. But the same, this is happening like concurrently with like the first slave ships arriving on like our shores. uh, Flash forward through a lot of history, moving into redlining. For those unfamiliar, between 1933 to 1940, the Homeowners Loan Association, which is a federal agency, divided neighborhoods into these color coordinated groups based on race, class, and ethnic composition that determined that financial institutions used to determine their lending risk. So this created just like deep seated scars on all of our cities and our towns. In particular, these cities that existed and were like large at the time, um, just create like, and there's just so much like disenfranchisement, and like Black families in particular were like barred from applying to key laws and policies that were just critical for like federal housing assistance programs. There's mandated discrimination in loans, homeownership programs, and zoning that they really lay the foundations for a lot of the poverty that we still see in cities. And just so much of our wealth is tied back to our like property ownings. And so it's for most people, it's like like the largest purchase they'll ever make in their entire life is their home. So when you deny people the ability to like develop that wealth, like you see it for generations. Following the redlining, you get into this era of urban renewal. So New Haven was an epicenter for urban renewal projects. Um, the mayor during like, the 50s and 60s, Richard C. Lee, had this like model city idea that the federal government kind of launched a lot in Connecticut. New Haven actually had some of the highest per capita spending on urban renewal projects of any city in the entire country. And so it really starts to like clear out slums, bring in suburban residents, and increase car infrastructure. So if you've driven through any of the big cities in Connecticut, they're all bisected by highways, and they continue to be to this day because there's urban renewal projects like tearing apart entire communities. The Oak Street connector in New Haven. I live in New Haven, which is why a lot of my examples are from New Haven. Um, oh, sorry. Or like from New Haven. Um, but so there was this vibrant Black community on Oak Street that was more working class, and the city tore down to build this highway. And they're trying to reckon with it now. It's like address the injustice now, but instead Pfizer has bought a lot of that land, and it's bringing in these like biomedical, like white collar jobs that are not that accessible to a lot of New Haven residents. And so I think we're seeing, oh, yeah, thank you. Okay. Um, like a lot of the problems like continue to exist, and we can like look back to the colonial era. There was a window. I think the 1997, Dr. Marc Mitchell forms the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice to oppose a power plant in Hartford after he found higher asthma rates among Black and Hispanic residents living near the waste treatment sites. That group today still exists, the Connecticut Coalition for Economic and Environmental Justice now. And they're doing really great work. And I think it's just so important any conversation of EJ in Connecticut to talk about major like, the giants who like led this work, Dr. Mark Mitchell, like Sharon Lewis, who were like just so pivotal in making this work happen. Next slide, please. I want to take a moment to discuss briefly the history of redlining in New Haven. Um, So I think just it's really important to, I think, discuss. I think it's really important to like take a little bit of time. I'm like I said, I live in New Haven, so I have these examples, but I think this is true for all the cities in Connecticut. Um, as you can see, there's a lot of red, there's a lot of yellow. These are like the D grades, these are the C grades, these are like the communities that were deemed like, worse to invest in. We still see the impacts to this day. There's multi-unit families, like multi-unit homes, these homes. Like there's no like single units. There's like smaller parcels of land. There's like majority like Black and brown communities. There's majority immigrant communities who at the like in the 30s and 40s live in these communities and still live in these communities today. And so like their wealth has just been stifled for decades now. And it's really important to like look at this history. And if we move on to the next slide, um, this is where the history matters. So if you remember back to like the last slide, think what the reds were, think about what the yellows were, and now look at this heat vulnerability map of New Haven, and you can see these darker red areas correspond to the more vulnerable communities, and then there are many of the same places. It's many of the same places that were deemed more dangerous and like to invest in and less desirable, and where their wealth has been denied. You see the impacts of that today. You can see the heat vulnerabilities. You can see it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at like Fairhaven, this is really personal to me. There's a station like on the river, the Mill River, the English station that my mom like grew up like walking distance to. And her and all of her sisters had asthma growing up. And my grandmother like passed away of COPD and like lived in this area of Fairhaven. So it's like very, and a lot of this, and why was that cited at the time? Because it was majority Black and immigrant working class communities, and there was no EJ considerations, and we saw those impacts decades later, and we continue to feel them. And when you look at this map, like it's so important to remember the harm that we have done as like, a country and as like all these institutions to kind of think about how we move forward. Um, I have more to say. I was a history major in school, so everyone wants to talk about it. I can say a lot about this, but it's just time I can move on to the next slide. I want to hit on some key like legislative and regulatory timelines also. So Connecticut was kind of an early adopter of environmental justice. DEEP adopted the environmental equity policy in 1993. So a year before the Clinton administration had their executive order. It was really about ensuring equal access to environmental benefits and protecting them from being like disproportionately facing the consequences of environmental pollution. Fast forward a couple of years, 2009, when Connecticut passes an act concerning EJ communities and the storage of asbestos-containing material. This bill really lays the foundation for a lot of the like EJ work that we're doing to this day in Connecticut. It defined EJ community, defined affecting facility. It required the environmental justice public participation plan, like new permits, new facilities and expansions, the written notice, the good faith effort. A lot of the really great stuff that we still have to this day, and it was so important, started in this 2009 law. About a decade later, in 2020, the legislature picked it back up with an act concerning enhancements to the state's environmental justice law. This mandated community environmental benefits agreements. Sorry, I was trying to save space on that. Where there's 5 existing facilities are located in the same municipality as the permit. Mandated posting of sign printed in all languages spoken by 15% of residents. It required written notice. It just starts to like take these next steps and making sure that we're really implementing and doing the work. And which brings us into today, in 2023, they passed another EJ law concerning the EJ program at DEEP. After to include informal public meetings must be recorded, and kind of brought us into the 21st century, I would say, this law. But accepting written comments and questions and making sure they're like being like, posted. If you've ever done a lot of work with it, a lot of times just like huge documents in these participation plan, like in the material, answering questions. Written notice to residents within a half mile of the facility. It involves community residents into negotiating the environmental benefits agreements. And it also tasked DEEP with developing regulations for relative impact of environmental public health stressors. That is a process that we are still in today. I discuss a little bit more later. But it really is just about like making sure we're continuing this EJ work, making sure these laws are not perfect. There's still issues like five existing facilities in the same municipality is hard because Connecticut has so many towns and cities, and they're all so close together. And when you do things on a municipal level, you're not considering the impact of the neighboring towns. So there's still work to be done. Um, but these laws are like doing something now. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I will very briefly just say there are lots of bills. There's lots of legislation happening this session. I think if you are a CTLCV fan and you are keeping up with the good work that they're doing, you know what their watch list. All these bills are on their watch list. I would encourage you to check them out. If we have time to talk about them later, happy to answer questions. Um, but just lots of things about like housing, transport chemicals, like food security, PFAS, like all these issues that are really important to like a more intersectional approach to environmental justice. Next slide, please. Sorry for also going so fast. I know we only have a few minutes left. We end in like 10 minutes. I want to respect everyone's time. A few other things. So there's the peer proceedings. Um, there's a docket right now, 240907, about equity, accessibility, and stakeholder engagement. I think Jameson could talk more about that if you have questions about it. But it's important to like, it's in the news a lot because of the Richard Gillette hearings, but it's important to like be involved on these spaces if you have the time and capacity. Like your voice matters so dearly. um, the deep EJ regulation rulemaking process. There's a public meeting that just happened yesterday online. There's another one happening tomorrow. Um, there's just really great stuff happening, and they're doing like really important work to like shaped deep regulations. And so strong community attendance is just really, really critical. They've been ongoing for a while. They will continue for a while. The next meeting is happening this summer. So if you have not been involved, it's a great time to get involved. Make sure your voice is heard. Make sure your community's voice is heard. And there's some future policy fights. Um, yeah. Uh, yeah, so future policy fights. There's like permitting updates. There's improving like the CT siting council. There's equal application of the Connecticut EJ law. Right now, municipalities below 10,000 are not included. It's about like updating our definition of EJ. Maybe that's something that's important to us. Maybe it's not. I think it's just about deciding like as a community what really matters. And then I have one more slide. And then just like in general, some ways I think to like handle this fight um, against environmental justice that we're seeing at the federal level. I think a really key one is to frankly get angry. I think we're often taught that like to not sit in our feelings. We're taught to like hold back that feeling. We're taught to like bring that down. There's a lot to be angry about right now. And like you should allow yourself to be angry and to do things like and to fight big and to be mad about these things. Um, I think like a big thing like right now is holding elected officials accountable. Connecticut has a Democratic supermajority and we have a Democratic governor, and we're still not accomplishing things. Other states have razor thin margins and are taking on big, bold fights and they get things done. Connecticut's not. And I think we need to be holding our officials accountable and making sure like what are we doing, guys? And getting into that, it's a dream big. I saw there was a comment about the leaf blower bill, and I want to talk about that. Um, that is an example of the state not dreaming big. There's just some new JFS language that makes it so now only state agencies are affected by that bill. And it passed through committee like that. And it's not going to actually affect like residents and the communities. It's only going to apply to state to them by 2029. I think they're talking about like making this incremental progress. Why does all the progress have to be incremental? When we have good solutions, we just are not being big, you're not being bold. And now is the time to like stand for something, frankly. I know we're almost out of time. So I just want to talk about like focus on like a justice-oriented environmental justice, making sure it's intersectional, educating yourself on racism, feminism, queer and trans liberation, redlining, immigration, food security, economic justice, healthcare. I have a ton of reading recs. I like knowledge is so powerful in these moments. I think I would really recommend it's really about feminism, but Hood Feminism by Miki Kendall. She really introduces this intersectional approach to these movements that have not been good about including other voices. And I think, specifically about feminism, but the lessons are applicable to the work that we're doing. I think it's about donating money to EJ orgs when you can. I think the Nonprofit Accountability Group, for example, is doing really, really exceptional work. And it's important to be supporting them as well. Like make sure that we're giving back to these communities who are doing so much on the ground work. Doing some mutual aid funds in your community. There's people in your town who like need you. Like if you have the funds and the ability to like do it and like be present, organize with them, make sure you're protesting with them, making sure you're protesting like how you can. There's a lot to be angry about in this moment. There's lots of like action to take. So like when you can do it, show up. And yeah, I think I will get off my little soapbox and open some conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you to Jameson. Thank you to Liliana. Thank you to C2V. Thank you to all of you for being here. Yeah, I'm excited to get questions and to talk. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both of you guys for doing such a great job on presentation. As you can see, we have our contacts here. I'll be sending out a follow-up email with all this information and some extra information that I know Mark and Jameson will be happy to provide. This will also be able to be found on our YouTube and website. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can look at questions, but please feel free to leave them in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, Vincent, I see your hand raised, so you can come off mute.
Okay, I think it works. I'm unmuted. Just an observation. First of all, thank you for the education. Every time I listen to people who are in this field, I learn more, and I really appreciate it. I've been working on the EV school bus situation in our town, and I just want to make an observation about differing EJ definitions. So, for example, with the EV school buses, there was quite a bit of money made available by the feds. And if you had a federally designated environmental justice area, you received more money for infrastructure, which is great because it's quite expensive to both buy the buses and put the infrastructure in place. The problem that we're running in our town is that the state law requires an expedited implementation for ZEV, zero emission vehicles for school buses for EJ communities, but the state doesn't give us any additional money for that. So in other words, we're subject to an expedited state requirement, but since it's not the same as the federal designation, we're not getting the federal funds. So it actually puts us in what is for us almost a $500,000 deficit that we have to try to get for our school funding. So I just want to point that out.
No, thank you for doing that, Vincent. Really appreciate it. I think what you brought up is definitely something that's worth, having a further discussion around. There are, environmental justice definitions are happening really right now in all 50 states, right? And that's because, as we talked about in the presentation, obviously with the rollbacks of the federal government, states need to step up. But I also think that's an opportunity for states to not work in their silos and really build regional coalition, right? So we know in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont, we're pretty blue up here, right? So wouldn't it be awesome if we could, those 5 states, New England states, including New York as well, can come together and be on the same page about, what are the things that where our threshold's gonna be, because remember, as we know with the federal government, whatever they set, that's the floor. And so we can go much higher than that. And so it'd be amazing, it'd be awesome. I think that's what you're gonna end up seeing, to be quite honest, in the not so distant future, because now we know there's just pressure on the states to have their skin in the game more than they have in the past, because there is like that floor is being removed. And so my hope is that you'll see a lot more regional coalition building and regional collaboration to be able to combat exactly what it is that you brought to the forefront, right? In terms of finding ways to make it more accessible, funds more accessible, and resources more accessible to the grassroots organizations and the organizations that need it most, without having a lot of different red tape based off of different definitions, different understandings. But that also is a factor because of one of the things that I mentioned, that one of my rabbit holes, affirmative action, which says you can't use race as a factor when you're discussing these things because it's actually discriminatory, is what the Supreme Court ruled. That creates a bit of a barrier, which also then makes states try to find unique ways of identifying EJ communities, which is why like Connecticut leans on economic rather than race, right? And so thank you for bringing that to the forefront.
And then Susan, I see your hand up if you have a question.
I do. First of all, thank you for this discussion. It's very, very helpful, and I do plan to organize around this. So I'm wondering, how are the decisions made in Connecticut where to locate power plants, for example, or where to put a pipeline? Like, how is it that they end up in environmental justice communities or actually create the conditions for it to become an environmental justice community? Who makes those decisions?
Yeah, so I think it's there's a lot of different considerations that go
You're
into
not you're not clear somehow? Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
It's somehow you're not
Is it
coming.
better?
Yeah, a little better. Yep.
Okay. So yeah, so there's a lot of factors that go into the considerations. A lot is happening with the CT Siting Council, honestly. So they like make a lot of the decisions as to like where the facility gets sited. So permits like applicants come to them with permit applications. And it's like a very long process. That there's like a lot of like public participation, working with like developers, identifying the locations. So a very like multi-year process to figure out like where to cite them, and they have to like bring their applications before the CT Citing Council, and applications go before DEEP as well. So DEEP has to give like air permits, and so like a lot of people are just involved, and lots of opportunities to get involved. But yeah, there's lots of it's like those are the two big actors to like make the decision.
And given that the laws, some of the environmental justice laws are getting a little bit stronger in Connecticut, although nowhere near where we need to be, is DEEP required to take this into consideration? That where that there are communities that, is it required that DEEP actually make that a consideration, I guess is what I'm saying.
So I think right now there's a lot of regulations. So if it is in an EJ community, there are like additional steps that they have to take. So if it's cited in an EJ community, for example, they have to do the public participation plan, and so those like factors have to be considered. You have to like listen to those voices. So there's a lot of work happening around cumulative impacts right now. It's like what DEEP is considering in their regulations. If you attend the meeting tomorrow, I mean, I think yesterday also. And so like really how they build in those like considerations as well. Because right now that's not being discussed as much. Because there's like not regulations, there's not really a framework for it yet.
Yes.
So
So
they're kind of limited. Oh, sorry, yeah.
no, you're good. I'm sorry, Mark.
No, continue. Yeah.
Well, what I was just gonna say is piggyback right off what you said, which is General Statute 22A to 20A. That's the environmental justice law. And so right now, what they're doing, me and Mark are highly involved in different sections of this. Is they're going through DEEP is having community meetings discussing environmental justice regulations. So we actually had one yesterday that I participated as a volunteer to help lead a breakout group with folks. And there actually is another one tomorrow happening in Bridgeport. And I hope, Sarah, when you see this, don't get mad at me because I don't have the sheet up for me to give them the exact day and time. But I know, actually, let me see if it's in my calendar. But it's tomorrow in Bridgeport at 6 o'clock at the Housatonic Community College, 900 Lafayette Boulevard in Bridgeport, Connecticut. That's workshop number 3 for the Connecticut Deep EJ regulations. That's an in-person meeting. So what the General Statute 22A to 20A says is it gives Deep two kind of things, really, for lack of a better term. Sorry. It's any source of environmental pollution that causes a potential health impact. And it's based off, so the conversation now is cumulative impacts, just to fill that in. So cumulative impacts meaning, what are all of the sources of pollution in that community, where are they coming from, how they cumulatively together have an effect on that neighborhood or that community. And the second part of that law gives them their charge, Deep's charge. In Deep's charge, they required, that's the key word, to develop regulations about the identification and the measurement of relative impact of environmental and public health stressors across communities. Okay, so that tells Deep that they have to look at any of the sources of pollution that are causing potential health impacts, but then it also gives them a charge which says that they are required to develop regulations. And so this process that they're going through now, kind of this tour of communities, it's educating communities exactly on this law, so then they can get feedback from the community to say, hey, community, this is what we did yesterday. What do you think the stressors are, right? What are the health stressors? What are the, there were 2 other categories I just drew a blank on, but there were 3 different sections. And Devin, if you're out there somewhere you want to jump in, feel free to do so. But that's what Deep's doing right now. So I would say look on the Deep website. They have on their website the list of public meetings. They have about at least 4 or 5 more they're going to do throughout the rest of the year. And they're all over the state of Connecticut. Like I said, this one's in Bridgeport. They had others somewhere else. They're going to have another one in New Haven and other places. So that is extremely important for us to get involved in, because this is our opportunity to tell Deep what we think is important in terms of the stressors. Like, what are they missing in terms of this community, having a stressor that's different than the Waterbury community, or the Danbury community having this different stressor than the West Haven community, right? So I would say definitely look to participate with Deep in that development.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Seeing no more questions, I think we can end it here, but feel free to email me, Marc or Jameson, with any questions. And also, hopefully tomorrow, if not tomorrow, Friday, you'll be getting a follow-up email from me with the presentation, link to the YouTube video, and then also any other information that we compile. But yeah, thank you guys all for attending. Thank you, Marc and Jameson, for giving a great presentation. I know I was sitting there learning as well. But yeah, thank you guys, and all have a good evening.